Welcome, officially. My name is Tamer. Conversations in Contemporary Art is a graduate seminar based in the MFA Visiting Artist program. It provides a unique opportunity to hear dynamic and influential artists, curators, cultural workers from various domains speak. It provides seminar participants as well as members of the public a chance to interchange with the guests and with each other on core questions in contemporary art. I invite you to join us over the course of the semester for the rest of the talks. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors first, David Howes and the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Society and Culture for their support of the talk tonight. Tonight, we welcome Hajra Waheed to SICA. Hajra received the prestigious 2014 Victor Martin Lynch Staunton Award for Outstanding Achievement as a Canadian mid-career visual artist and was shortlisted for the 2016 Sobey Art Award, Canada's preeminent contemporary art prize. Her works can be found in permanent collections of MoMA, the British Museum, the NGC, and others from Zurich and Hong Kong to New Delhi. Her works are scattered across the globe, and very often they poetically evoke that globe too. Struggling to find a language for the dizzying range of tendencies in global contemporary art, the art historian Terry Smith suggests that some of the most provocative work these days is best described in terms of activities rather than mediums. World picturing, placemaking, and connecting are three promising ones for him. Hajra's multidisciplinary art brings this into focus for me. It includes interactive installations, collage, video, sound, sculpture, and painting arranged in complex narrative structures to explore pressing issues such as the hiddenness of power, surveillance, and the traumas and alienation of displacement and mass migration. To push past Smith's terms a bit, in Hajra's works we see a world pictured in a state of repair, mental, liminal, and physical places made livable for the moment, and quiet, elegant connections made against a late capitalist grain of alienation. Over the last decade, Hajra has participated in exhibitions worldwide, most recently at the 57th Venice Biennale. By all accounts, her work at Venice was wonderful. In an article for Canadian Art, Kwame Morgan Freer describes Hajra's room in the Biennale's Viva Art Viva exhibition as, quote, an entire world, built or conjured with small fragments and glimpses into a life remembered and documented. A rising tide in that ancient and sinking city. We welcome you home with congratulations on this and your other successes to our chillier but much safer island of Montreal. Please join me in welcoming Hajra.
Thank you so much for having me, Tamer, and for the department as well. I have one of those cough colds. I don't know how many of you in the audience does, so if I start having a coughing attack, forgive me. I was raised in Darin within the gated headquarters of Saudi Aramco, the Arabian American oil company. My family spent 22 years there between 1982 and 2004. So through the end of the Gulf War, First and Second Gulf Wars, and the Cold War as well. The history of Darin is an interesting one. It began in 1930 when King Abdul Aziz began allowing foreigners to investigate and evaluate the potential oil and mineral resources of his country. By 1933, the Saudi Minister of Finance and a lawyer from SOCAL, which was the Standard Oil Company of California, signed an agreement giving that firm the exclusive rights to explore, prospect, drill for, extract, treat, manufacture, carry away, and export oil and oil products. Darin, its headquarters, rests on a hilly, rocky patch of desert that you can see up in this background. in the eastern province, where most of the earliest productive oil wells in the country were drilled for, including well number 7, or Prosperity Well, which you can also see burning in the background, considered the first commercially viable well in the country, and it is one that still flows today. Over the last 80-plus years, Saudi Arabia's most abundant and controversial natural resource has managed to sustain Aramco, the largest transnational oil corporation in the world, which continues to provide the expertise and facilities for the export of 25% of the world's oil and natural gas resources. Initially, Darin was considered a rustic camp, an all-male outpost in which Saudi and American oil men were there to do the work they're there to do and use the bare essentials. Today, it's often characterized as a gated corporate levittown, arousing both the anxieties and images of a 1950s gated Southern California, or in this case, New York suburb. It's complete with cul-de-sacs and streets named after those familiar to the US, like Spruce and Holly and Cherry and Walnut and Prairie. There are trim 1- and 2-story homes, all identical in style, surrounded by lawns set off by hedges and trees and flowers. The community has recreational facilities and other amenities of modern North American life, including 2 schools. Designed for children of Saudi Aramco employees and structured in the way of a mainstream US public school system. During the years that I attended, Saudis were not allowed to live inside the compound or attend the school system. Arabic was not taught, nor Middle East history. Only US history, with the option of studying either French or Spanish. Most of my teachers were Mormons from Salt Lake City, Utah, Texas, or Ohio. These are just 4 images that were taken by ex-Saudi employees in 1957. This is of the biannual Darin parade. Employees followed corporate regulations, not Sharia law. Women could drive inside the compound. There weren't any regulations on dress, and there were co-ed facilities where the country otherwise disallowed it. For years, Darin has been protected by US and Saudi air bases, an in-compound security force, the CIA, the Saudi Secret Service, with strict regulations around access and the prohibition of photographic and video equipment. Employees and their families are required to use identification cards at armed and gated checkpoints upon entering this 30-square-mile radius. Essentially, I grew up in a microcosm of the colonial order, in the centerfold of what remains a contentious geopolitical hotspot. It remains the world's largest energy producer and is considered the most valuable company on the planet, exceeding Facebook by many unknown trillions of dollars. The kind of secrecy and isolation I grew up in became the very undercurrents that as a child influenced my play, the interests I gravitated towards, and the questions that I asked. I developed an obsession pretty early on with identifying aircraft and tracking flight routes, and keeping a log of my observations in a sort of cryptic visual language. And in many ways, this very language still seems to inform my practice. And you'll see this later on when I speak to specific bodies of work. When I was 14, I was enrolled in and sent to Emma Willard. It was in upstate New York. It was the first school dedicated to women's higher education in the United States, and it's the school where the women's suffrage movement came out of. Our family couldn't, by any stretch of the means, afford boarding school. But part of Saudi Aramco's corporate regulations required that all employees' children leave the country after grade 9. As part of what I've come to understand as a cultural reassimilation program of sorts. my father was given two options: either leave his position as a geologist and risk being out of work indefinitely, which was always a likelihood in his position, or keep it and enroll me in boarding school funded by the company, which he ended up doing to 2 out of 3 of us sisters. Looking back, the biggest challenge I remember having wasn't leaving home at 14, but having to navigate between the bombardment of polarizing feminist ideologies, the feeling of being forced by adults in my life to choose between one feminist ideology or camp and another, especially as a teen in the 90s, and it was exhausting and limiting, and admittedly reminiscent of the kinds of conversations I still seem to be having and have entered around today's Bill 62. But that said, I am very grateful and incredibly grateful for the multiple perspectives I've been afforded in having gone through this process. They've shaped a more nuanced understanding and relationship of power, and my relationship to power, privilege, and difference, concerns that I have deeply felt from a very young age, themes that have been hugely influential to both my teaching and art practice. But yes, I do approach my work and process experiences from a particular position that encompasses being a woman of color, with complex ties and relationships to North America, the Middle East, South Asia, having been born of Muslim immigrant parents. In a world that's been formed on the bedrock of systemic racism and sexism, it's hugely important for me to use my practice as a way of re-engaging with some of the global issues that continue to be infused both in my childhood but even today. So we've been passing through some images. We're now at a yearbook. There's a little swell of people. I was 4, my sister was 8, and this was the school that had come out for a yearbook picture, and an aerial photograph was shot from a helicopter of all of us. But you can kind of get a sense of how isolated it was. It was literally stretches of vast desert, and then this community. When I was 17, I was accepted into the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and able to attend only because I had received a full merit scholarship to complete my BFA degree. And I remember sitting in my first class in school, and it was a Photo 101 class, and I was so excited to be taking photography. And I went and looked at the syllabus, and at the bottom of the course syllabus, it said that the course fees would be up to $1,200 just in terms of equipment and materials. So across the hall I went to a drawing class with a 0 fee policy, and all it stated was that I needed paper to draw on. And so I would head to the most obscure and back alley stationery shops and bookstores across the south side and the west sides of Chicago, in search of shop owners and bookkeepers who were willing to relinquish old paper or material for free that had been sort of sunned in their storefronts. I can't say that I'm broke now, but years later, I still search these kinds of materials out wherever I travel, and they're often either found or gifted to me by friends. Material that I've always described as having a sort of presupposed history, an embedded history. I do see my practice as a slowly unfurling one, and sort of similar to a chronicle or story that reveals itself over the course of a lifetime, rather than any one space of an exhibition. So it can get a little bit unwieldy and complicated at times, and you'll have to forgive me. But hundreds of works end up speaking to one another, addressing one another, and finishing each other if you allow them to over time. Here is a stark example of this. It's the Scrapbook Project. It's a body of work that began in 2010. It's the first of 3. It was started, I had actually found this text on the ground, since we're on home turf, you'll know. I was living on an esplanade at the time, and I had a studio on Pine, so I was walking along between the two, and I'd found this on the ground. It was empty, and I sat on it for a year, and then I started working into it. I found it 7 years after my family left Aramco. You see, once you leave the compound, you can't return. So for my parents who spent 22 years there, for me it wasn't really very important, but for my parents who it was all that they had known for so long, it was quite devastating, and I did see how much of a state of exile they experienced in that process of losing a place that they called home and not being able to return to it. So I hadn't been back to the region in over 7 years, and I started to create a set of pages, note pages, and diaristic notes. And so this holds that kind of, each page of it holds actually a very distinct set of memories for me. I've always worked this way, but this sort of body of work around notebooks and collecting diaries and entry points is one that is most familiar and most intimate. So each page of this is actually very distinctly important. I won't go through all of them, but the first page of the scrapbook is actually a transfer, and I can't actually point to it. I don't think we have a pointer here, but the first lines just say, "This book belongs to," in Arabic, and then you would write your name and your address, and if stolen, or your phone number, and if it was, and then at the bottom lines it says, "If stolen, please return to," and says Mr. So, which is very referential in terms of mehram, because the guardian in Saudi Arabia, the male guardian, father, brother, son, or husband, is who was responsible for you. And under the case of living within these corporate regulations, I was a dependent of the employer, who was a male, and often, and mostly 90% of the time, and was my father. So the book didn't actually. It was a kind of symbolic to who the book really belonged to. This is just a small piece. I do a lot of work with transfers and collages and drawings. A lot of my work tends to be centered to the page. It has a kind of very particular kind of vocabulary of repetition, of cataloging, and there's a lot of symbols and text that refer one image or one page to the next. So this is a page, and sort of reflective of the King Abdulaziz Airport that was built after the first Gulf War, which brought in a lot more planes and activity actually into the area, and which was quite symbolic for me, and in terms of the amount of travel that was starting to happen. This is the first stadium built in the region, dedicated to public space. That's not a religious space. It was built in the UAE. I found that to be significant. This piece was done in lieu of the Kober bombings, which I was there for in 1996. And so it goes on. The expectation is not that one would necessarily know that, or to be able to access these stories per se, but when I do meet up with people and talk to them, there's always these stories that come out, and I'm fine with that. But these personal stories come out one-on-one rather than in another way, or in a public space, in a more public way, I would say. So I'm going to just walk through a few works. They're very arbitrary because there's hundreds of them, and I don't know, one bleeds into the other. The video installation project is also a long-term body of work, and I consider it a sister project to the Scrapbook Project. It's not based it's not a two-dimensional work. It's actually based in the realm of video. Video at the time was a new medium to me when I began this project. But the micro-narratives I saw around me constantly were something that were not new to me. While I was doing my doctoral field research in 2011 in the region, well, I ended up quitting it after 4 years, but this process, I started capturing what I saw around me, more specifically that particular moment when the spectacular and the mundane collide and something magical transgresses into your otherwise everyday. The video installation is composed of dozens of these collected moments. These were shown at the MACA most recently, and I have to say they were on for quite a run. The show was extended 3 times, so I think 9 months or something like that. But there was a sequence of 10 vignettes, but I've collected many more since then. And those were shot between 2011 and 2013, some of which was shot alongside and with a dear friend of mine, because I could not shoot them by myself at times because it required a man to be present to make these shoots happen. So was my friend Daniel. But these were shot, all of these small vignettes were shot in locations where photographic and video documentation is prohibited. So none of the work is staged. All the vignettes are filmed from sort of an observational point of view, and quite reminiscent of CCTV footage. Viewers here are left to decide whether each scene is either benign or censored, objective, misdirected, or purely speculative. The themes of feeling watched and have always permeated my work, as does my obsession with the activities in the sky above me and the ground below me. Growing up in a tiny community in the middle of the desert, where there was so much activity happening as a result of either secret air bases nearby or so much drilling of resources nearby. I'm going to take you through an exhibition I recently did over a year or so ago, but it helps to understand and ground the hundreds of works that kind of are involved with the ongoing sort of investigations I have around surveillance and our current aerial occupation. The Ciphers was curated by Alessandro Vincentelli at the Baltic Center for Contemporary Art, and it expanded on my long-standing relationship to and inquiries around our current aerial occupation. And it highlighted sort of the ever-increasing militarization of sky and space, where the circulations of drones and military surveillance technology tends to extend itself over everyday life, often with lethal consequences. Give me a second. I ended up combining video, collage, sound, and sculpture. Hundreds of works came together to explore the larger codes and operations of security and surveillance from a more intimate perspective. The exhibition pointed a lot more of the existential questions that sort of constantly arise, and having sort of lived under the shape-shifting gaze of the roving eye over a lifetime. I've always been interested in the civilian's role in this paradigm of control, a vertical control that has begun to preside over all of us and our very understanding and imagining of the world. So much of the exhibition at the Baltic played with sort of unfamiliar points of view, from the perspective of a spinning, falling or roving object to that of an omnipresent entity looking down from above. The exhibition, just as a brief note, I'm showing you this slide because it opened with that first drawing. Alessandra actually came to visit and spent 5 days living at my studio, and he had full access to the space. And he came across some work I had done when I was like 17 and 18 and 20 and 23. And this is a work from when I was 23. And he wanted to make sure he opened the show with this work. I think probably because I think he wanted people to understand how long and I have been butting my head against this kind of these kinds of issues. But with that, I want to play a video. It brings me to a piece of footage which was inspired the entire exhibition, and which is called sort of a study for a falling object. It's not my work, but it definitely inspired a sound piece and dozens of works that are included in the show. And it was I found it in 2006. It's a piece of NASA footage, and I'll let you watch that. It's 5 minutes long. So, Vitaly, if you can do me the honor. The work itself, actually, give me a second, let me find it. So the ciphers, and I'll come back to this piece, but these are some images of the exhibition. There were, it was on the ground floor of the Baltic, and actually the video installation project and the Scrapbook Project, both of which I went through, was in this exhibition as well. I'm just showing you part of it. This piece of NASA footage, which was also in the exhibition as a sort of study, and it coincides with a sound piece that I worked on with musician Laurel Springermeyer, who I hope is in the audience today. Essentially, it's a 10-minute piece. So what happens is that this video footage is 5 minutes long, but throughout the entire exhibition is another 5-minute sound piece that's on loop. So it's a total of 10 minutes on loop, and essentially it completes the fall. So essentially, you not only sort of see this object, falling from space through the atmosphere and into the ocean, but then you also sort of get a sense through the sound piece of this object coming onto shore, being found by somebody, having this object be strapped up and pulled into a workshop and tinkered away on. The ciphers was a new work and sort of the exhibition's namesake, and it debuted at the show's center and later at the Sobey Award exhibition, and it's now part of the National Gallery's permanent collection, and so you can sort of see it currently on view at the Canadian Biennial. But the installation itself essentially consists of a large platform bearing a number of metal objects that appear to have fallen from the sky, possibly as debris from an explosion. Viewers have to circumnavigate the work like they do many of the exhibition spaces I tend to sort of create, and the notes left behind, there are 18 notes that you sort of come upon, are used as a way to piece together a larger story of secrecy, surveillance. This is a body of work also that some of you may have come across in 2014. It was shown at the Montreal Biennale and commissioned there. It brings together various elements, including 32 works on paper and a sound sculpture, and it's quite connected to the previous work that you saw, the ciphers. And it's called KH21. It makes reference to the recently declassified Hexagon program, whereby there were 20 satellites, photographic reconnaissance satellites, that were launched between 1971 and 86, and only one survived. And so in moving through the installation, a story seems to emerge in reading through the notes, but also there have been dozens of other works that have been compiled since then. And a story emerges about an estranged ex-flight engineer who seems to have dragged something in or something lost from the sky. And unable to decipher fact from fiction, viewers find themselves in a space where potentially the real merges with the imagined. You are able to, as a viewer, listen in to the sound, to this piece. So it's a bit of an intermediate object that translates the reverberation of its own flight path in a way. at the same time that that exhibition was taking place, and sort of speaking to various threads that of issues that I tend to work with and through. The Mosaic Rooms in London was also opened an exhibition that revolves around another long-term project that I've spent a great deal of time submerged in since 2010 or 11. And it's called Sea Change. Sea Change, which I can only best describe as a visual novel, came into fruition after years of collecting news reports about disappearances. And then in December of 2011, I became fixated on one particular account in which there were 166 pilgrims, Hajis, that were traveling from Calcutta, India, to Saudi Arabia on the pretext of making the pilgrimage to Mecca. And so they entered the country, but then when it was time to make headcount to leave, they were nowhere to be found. And so the disappearance was quite quickly overlooked in the media, but the story itself stayed with me. And since then, Sea Change has grown to encompass a larger narrative that revolves, or I wouldn't say a larger narrative, but a story that revolves around 9 protagonists, that over the course of 9 chapters, these 9 stories of transformation are revealed. So kind of much like the flotsam or jetsam of a shipwreck, thousands of these fragments or works over a lifetime will come together to form these visual memoirs. And I have the first installment, which is called Chapter 1, Character 1 in the rough, focuses on a geologist in search of quartz. Evidence of this journey within the works itself reveals essentially through all of these material traces, such as manic field notes and pseudoscientific drawings, geological maps and survey guides, return letters, dragged and left objects, spliced film, and photographs. Through that, you start to get a sense of this character, his motivations, his sense of loss and longing, his story. I guess I'm most interested in how epic journeys and epic desires can both pacify and obliterate us, and so Sea Change is founded on this very notion. At the Venice Biennale right now, and there's so much to go through, so I'll let there be time for questions. I don't know how long I've been going through, probably not very long, but at the Venice Biennale right now, there is a body of work up that's also part of Sea Change, and I don't know how many of you have seen it in person, but essentially this is a work called a short film. There are hundreds of slides here, and essentially, well, the Venice Biennale, you're not allowed to move these step stools across the room. You'll have to experience this in another space. There's actually a laser that, if you come too close, makes really annoying sounds that could not say. I wasn't allowed to. I wasn't able to get past. So, but essentially, you are supposed to walk up on these step stools and or push them across the room, and over the course of hundreds of slides that are collaged from 25 photographic postcards that were gifted to me, actually from a deck of 100 by a dear friend of mine, which I then, they were from the 1930s and 40s, and a dear friend of mine gave them to me. His grandfather actually had given to him, and he had asked me to do something with them, so it took a year before I could have the guts to cut them up, and but I did, and I started to trace back this story of this geologist who, over the course of these works, and who, when people follow through it, it's a story of a man who's in search of quartz, and he is traveling through the Western Himalayas. So you kind of get a sense by reading the works. You get a sense of these journeys that he's making. And at the center of it is a sort of platform that you can view into to get a glimpse of the character. But you essentially, at the Venice Biennale right now, it's a room in the Giardini, and I was very honored to be in a room next to Marwan, a Syrian painter who just recently passed away, and MacArthur Binion, another wonderful painter. Essentially, when you walk into the space, you also circumnavigate it, and you piece it together. There were a series of paintings in the exhibition. I studied painting and drawing at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I was in the advanced painting department there, but I never returned to painting after I left school. It took me 14 years, actually. I think that's sort of a tendency, is that art school has the capacity of killing the love you might have for a practice that is so deeply connected to yourself. So painting is a very intimate and emotionally connected practice of mine, but I couldn't return, and I really need to find myself within it again. So the first paintings I decided to do, that I had the guts that I was to do, were in 2014 or so, and I said to myself, if I was ever going to paint, I'd start by painting the sea, and so that's what I did here. And those paintings are up at Venice. And I was also invited. I was 7 months pregnant when I received the invitation by Christine Massel to participate. So I was very pregnant and on the phone, like, yes, of course, I will do this. Oh, right, a full room and new work. Okay, well, let's, yes. Had no idea how I was going to make it happen. But I decided that, of course, this is what I tend to do, that I was going to make paintings, and return once again back to probably the most intimate part of my practice. And so A Vow, which has only been seen there, but I'm honored to say quite a few people have by now. But A Vow 1 through 38 is a series of 38 apparitions in the night, is what I consider them. They're a collection of 38 blue paintings on tin, and they were formerly inspired by votive offerings or traditional ex votos. And they too reveal the story of character one, or a small aspect of it. It's probably the most representational navigation of that story. Between each painting, there is the use of the cosmos, which is, I consider, a marker of time, and hints to a lot of the longing, loss, and displacement that character one feels, and so it's through the eyes of character one. And I'll just slowly reveal them to you, and then I'll close here, and then you can ask questions. Thank you so much.
So we actually have brand new microphones this time. They will work. Oh, but we have to figure out how to turn them on. It's just the button.
All right, thank you. I actually have two questions. My first one was regarding Saudi Arabia. You mentioned the difficulties and even the impossibility of working there at some point, especially doing your video work. What would be the status if you wanted to go back? Would you be like you would have to be accompanied, or it would be possible to shoot now? Or is the restrictions still apply, still the same?
No, I think the restrictions are different. You have to get sponsored into Saudi Arabia, and there's actually quite a strong art scene in Saudi Arabia, doing really interesting work, despite the challenges that I think that artists face there. So I think it is possible. If I wanted to return, I could. I'm not sure how I don't. It's not something that I've actually considered for quite some time. But perhaps if the opportunity arose, I would be curious. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. And I was just curious about the use of writing in your practice. I understand you didn't do an MFA, but you wrote a thesis. And is this something that you still do?
Yes, I wish I could bury that. I can't believe I tried to. I really did. Try to call it in. I tried. It's in the world, and it's not supposed to be. I did. I write. Yes, I do. But I don't think I think that Sea Change is being written, and but I just find a different format for it. So people have asked me whether I will ever sort of compile a text, like one big fat story that they can just sift through and come to the end to, and I can't give them a yes on that. It's not going to happen. But there are other ways to enter stories, and oral stories travel quite similarly to the same process that I am using. So I have faith in oral tellings and oral stories. I think that, and so, I mean, I guess that's how I can answer that.
Anyone else? No? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for speaking. You recently, like just before you closed, said something, and I'm not sure if I wrote it down correctly, but you said, "I'm interested in how epic journeys can both pacify and obliterate."
Mm-hmm.
Is that, did I get that right?
Yes.
I found that really interesting, and I was wondering if you could speak a bit to what you mean by pacify and obliterate simultaneously, and how you think that relates to your interest in storytelling.
It's a very good question. I think I mean I probably won't answer to the question exactly to the question, but I think I would say that I see my practice as one that is lifelong and that is many threads, and very much in a part of my experiences, but also the news accounts that I read, to the stories that I hear. So everything to the kinds of images that are constantly threaded through me, because we are just inundated, with images and documentation of everything and anything. I just sort of see myself as and this process as more of a vehicle. And so when I think of this process of making work, I guess I would say I can't imagine that I could sort of begin and end a project, or end a thread of inquiry over the course of like one particular body of work. And in that way, it can sometimes obliterate us because there is no end in sight. If there was an end, perhaps it would just pacify us. I don't know if there's a. I don't know really how to describe it, but I think that I couldn't do justice to telling stories of that are very important, stories that need to be told, of persons that are often forgotten, misrepresented, marginalized, cast aside, left behind, fallen through the cracks, that a story would happen over the course of the exhibition. And so that's why I feel like the only way I can see this body of work as sea change and each character is to make it a meditation, and make it one that is long, and that means that so that I can at least do my part in honoring each, if that makes any sense.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I've got one on this side too. You're surrounded. Yeah. James.
Sorry.
I'm just curious, as you get busier and you're starting to think more about like rooms and exhibitions that you have to fill, has there been a switch in your practice of just like producing, independent, like the Scrapbook, for example, or individual paintings, and moving towards having to, you're talking a lot about like circumnavigation and like how the viewer like gets to experience the work. So I was just curious about how that shifts and how that's affected.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm always thinking about it, exhibition spaces, and that means that I have to ensure that works speak to one another, and that they speak to the room itself and the space itself, and that they can hold their own. Sometimes some works don't hold their own by themselves, and they require other works to sort of help describe or sort of finish them. But I always leave just enough room so that viewers can kind of have the capacity to sort of reimagine, or so that not everything is to be filled into the blanks, that there is room to breathe, and that one or viewers have the capacity to do so. So I do leave a lot of space within the exhibition, within a particular exhibition, but there's always enough threads to tie everything together. Does that make sense? Some works are larger works and they are standalone, not larger in terms of scale or size, but just in terms of, I guess maybe just in terms of their comprehensiveness. So yes, in ways they do stand alone, but they're not completed, if that makes sense fully.
Do you think you'll do more paintings?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Broke the ice.
I think I broke the. Sometimes it takes. What's 38 plus 10? 48. 48. I knew that, but it takes a lot of work to get through to get through that big chunk of ice. Yeah.
Just kind of following suit on the last question, and then just even as I'm looking at this image, I'm going back to the earliest, kind of documentations of the landscapes within which you kind of inform much of your practice. And there is such a sense of absence of the body that I feel translates into the work. So I'm curious to hear you speak about the absence and the presence, because on the one hand, this latter piece of kind of creating that one character of the geographer and the geographer's narrative is got a visual narrative going, but so much of the continuity of all of your work kind of speaks to me, or I see the absence of those characters, and I'm curious about how you contend with that, of those stories, because visually there's kind of an absence.
Yeah, I mean, it's not entirely true, because when you go into the room in Venice, there is a pedestal that you look through, and there is this sort of visual document of this, what seems to be some actual a figure of sorts. And there's a woman also that's in this body of work, and there are hands. So there is the physical human is there, but it is true I don't tend to work with the body very much at all. I think that's just sort of inherent to maybe not. I mean, I think that's a result of not pursuing it, even when I was a kid, or like the lack of documentation of the body, and my relationship to photographic documentation, and of it not happening very much, and I also have a very strange relationship to being documented, to documentation, to being documented, the self being documented.
Cut it.
I know this is a first. You won't see very much of this happening. So
don't worry, you're in the dark anyway.
Oh, good, perfect, even better. But yeah, but the landscape, and I mean, we're talking about like much larger, like landscape board, is very evident in my work, and the human self is also very evident in the work. It's just not in the ways that are generally exemplified, or that tend to happen. And so, people are often, they walk around a space and they still have a lot of questions, but then much of it is also pieced together, and it's through the text. There is quite a bit of text in the work. There is, and there are symbols. I just ask viewers to read for themselves. I think we're so used to being told what to read and how to read it, and artworks always seem to be, these days, tied very nicely in a bow, with every sort of gesture being very well articulated, and theoretically backed up. And I guess I don't really care to always do that. I implore you guys to try that. It can be sometimes liberating. Or some of you. Whoever of you would like to find, perhaps would like to do. I don't know. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for a great talk. I was wondering about your relationship to the collections. Like, it seems like you're somebody who collects things a lot, and also through seeing your work, I was able to visit like 2 of the exhibitions in Canada that you did, and I feel like you have this persona who is an analyst and also archivalist of these debris or like of these documents. And I was wondering if you have like some sort of methodologies when you are collecting things, and if you have developed some of these methods in terms of collecting that you would eventually make into a work of art.
It's a really great question. So whenever you see a title of a work, there's a set of numbers associated right after it. So here we are, Avow 1 through 38. That's a true collector moment. It's a way of cataloging, and I've always done it in my work. So every work actually has a catalog of how many were made. And how many were made was really just has very much to do with how many pages or objects that I was able to collect of that. So sometimes it says architectural studies 1 through 17, and you wonder why 17, and it's only because there were 17 pages of that. So that's a cataloging method that I use, and my website sometimes has a breadth of cataloging in it. It's unwieldy at times. There's categories, and then I make work within those categories. And my website, I call it the brain, but it doesn't have everything in it ever, everything that I've made, but it gives a sense of how I sort of make work. So I often approach a new work from the items that I've collected or have been gifted to me. So a lot of it is very materially based. It often starts with the material itself.
I'll just try and project from here. Oh, that was a great talk, thank you. I was wondering, with these open-ended projects, if you imagine then over years and years a further accumulation of works that do inform each other and that sort of could continue to be shown and grow and grow and grow in sheer quantity. And I was thinking about what you said about the Baltic show, where the curator came, lived in your studio, or stayed at your studio for 4 or 5 days and sort of sifted through and made choices. Do you have a preference as you project into the future whether these projects, as the sheer volume and number of collections within collections and in a larger sort of narrative, or maybe it's not a narrative, an open-ended story, is your dream scenario that you get to keep making the choices unilaterally, or do you like the idea that curators would be either solely responsible or collaboratively responsible for recontextualizing these collections over time?
Thank you for that. Yes, I would. I'm always so curious when others actually, curators, writers, actually approach my work as something that they can mine, and just as I mine material and documents, and I hope that others will be in desire to do the same, and I sort of see that as a collaborative process, absolutely, because there's so much that I actually don't see or don't know or can't bring to the project because I'm inside of it, that others I think can, and so I really look forward to the day that that many more of these works fill rooms and are able to sort of and that that a curator might be able to navigate the stories and play with the material that's already out there in ways that will sort of shed light on what's said in a much more comprehensive way, or in a way that I wasn't or hadn't been foreseen.
Maybe a follow-up? do you have views on how your work was curated in, I guess it's in Alberta, in the new Biennale, between Alberta and Ottawa? Do you have views on the curatorial premise of the Biennale and sort of where you fit in it? And a supplementary question, what does this Biennale mean for Canadian art? Does it do what it promises to do, namely approach contemporary art curation as a global matter and explode the national frame, or not?
Well, I haven't seen the show, so I didn't go to Alberta, so I can't speak to how it was sort of organized, and I haven't gotten any documentation of it yet, so I can't speak to that. I think the Canadian Biennial, I hope that the Canadian Biennial is set up and based on a premise of collection. So it's works that were recently collected by the National Gallery, and then a show is curated around a collection. So it's I guess I would say that I'm of the ilk that perhaps that I would hope that maybe that those barriers are broken, and that the Canadian Biennial is also not just about collected works, but works that speak to an exhibition thematic and that are not part of the collection, so that, and that do highlight and showcase artists working on similar issues and themes. So I guess that's where I stand in terms of the Canadian Biennial. But I think that the AGA show is actually really strong and has some really interesting works in it. I've seen many of those works at different capacities. In terms of showcasing recently acquired works, well, the National Galleries, there's some really nice works in there, but I can't speak to the rest.
Any other questions? Are you ready for a Friday night drink?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's thank Hajra.
Thanks, you guys.